And now from TreasureIslandOldies.com, here's the rock and roll news for the week of May 12th. In 1967, a British radio station debuted the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in its entirety. In 1958, the movie Let's Rock with Paul Anka, Danny and the Juniors, and the Royal Teens opened up. The Frank Sinatra Timex TV special aired this week in 1960 with Elvis Presley. Was called Welcome Home, Elvis. And the two of them sang a medley of Love Me Tender and Witchcraft. And in other Elvis news, fans ripped the shirt off Elvis's back after his Jacksonville, Florida concert this week in 1955. And Johnny Tillotson was the opening act at that concert, and he did see the fans ripping the shirt off of Elvis's back. Elvis's movie Tickle Me premiered in Hollywood this week in 1965 and opened nationally 2 weeks later. In 1975, a radio station in Jacksonville, Florida, knocked out the city's phone service while they were giving away tickets to Elvis's concert. In 1970, this week, the Beatles film Let It Be opened in New York City. Buddy Holly's optometrist gave him contact lenses for his 2800 eyesight, but he couldn't get used to them, so the glasses became his trademark, and they stayed. The first Cliff Richard movie, Serious Charges, premiered this week in 1959. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young released Ohio 10 days after the shooting of 4 students at Kent State University that inspired them to write the song in 1970. The Rolling Stones signed with Decca Records in London this week in 1963. They had turned down the Beatles a year earlier. Randy Bachman left the Guess Who this week in 1970. The Who's Pete Townsend was arrested on stage in New York after mistakenly kicking a cop that he thought was a fan rushing the stage this week in 1969. In 1960, Motown Records was formed. The Beach Boys released Pet Sounds in 1966. In 1958, the hometown of Jerry Lee Lewis held Jerry Lee Lewis Day in Faraday, Louisiana. Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard appeared together for the very first time on stage. No, it wasn't in the 1950s. It was at Sheffield, England in 1995. The first Monterey Folk Festival that featured Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Peter, Paul, and Mary took place this week in 1963. And speaking of Bob Dylan, the documentary film Don't Look Back premiered this week in San Francisco in 1967. In 1981, Diana Ross left Motown Records and signed a $20 million contract with RCA Victor. At the time, it was the most lucrative contract ever offered. The Buddy Holly Story movie premiered this week in Dallas, Texas in 1978, and of course it starred Gary Busey. The Conway Twitty movie Platinum High School opened this week in 1960. In the studio, Badfinger began recording No Matter What in 1970. The Kinks recorded Sunny Afternoon in 1966. Jan and Dean began recording The Little Old Lady from Pasadena in 64. The Rascals cut People Gotta Be Free in 68, and same year, Tony Joe White recorded Polk Salad Annie. Frank Sinatra recorded The Summer Wind this week in 1966. A double recording session took place this week in Jackson, Mississippi in 1970. In the same studio, Gene Knight recorded Mr. Big Stuff, and in the same location, just in a different room, King Floyd cut Groove Me. The Animals recorded House of the Rising Sun in 1964, and the Hollies recorded Bus Stop this week in 1966. Birthdays for you: Steve Winwood, former member of Traffic, the Spencer Davis Group, and Blind Faith. He's 65. Billy Swan is 71. James Purify from James and Bobby Purify is 69. George Carlin, born this week in 1937. Burt Bacharach turns 85, and he is our senior citizen this week. Stevie Wonder is 63. Mary Wells, born in 1943. Richie Valens, born 1941. Nervous Norvis, whose real name was James Drake, born this week in 1912. Bobby Darin was born in 1936. Troy Shondell is turning 69. Charlie Gracie, 77. Lenny Welch, 73. Trini Lopez is turning 76. Mike Oldfield, 61. Isaac Red Holt from Young Holt Unlimited and the Ramsey Lewis Trio He's 80 this week. Corinthian Crip Johnson from the Dell Vikings was born in 1935. Big Joe Turner, born 1911. Albert Hammond is 70. Perry Como, born in 1912. Eddie Arnold, born 1915. And Kai Winding, born this week in 1922. And from TreasureIslandOldies.com, that's your rock and roll news for the week of May 12th. Come to the Treasure Island Oldies blog for all the late breaking news at TreasureIslandOldies.com. And then click blog. Thanks for listening. I'm Michael Godin.
Treasure Island Oldies.